Bill Spencer sat in the dimly lit study of his sprawling Bel Air mansion, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a vice. His fingers trembled slightly as he stared at the leather-bound ledger in front of him, a ledger that chronicled every clandestine transaction he'd orchestrated in recent weeks. The sum total of those entries was staggering. Hundreds of thousands earmarked for secret clinical trials, wire transfers to hidden Swiss accounts, a final payment of $1 million dispatched through Grace Buckingham to secure Liam's life-saving treatment. Bill had always prided himself on his power, his ability to bend fortunes, manipulate markets, and protect those he loved at any cost, but this time, the stakes were higher, the risks more personal than ever before. The decision to spirit his grandson out of Los Angeles General under cover of night, to bypass the hospital's administration and transport him across continents for an unapproved therapy, had been made in a single, fevered moment of desperation. Liam's bright eyes, dull with pain and fatigue, haunted Bill's every nightmare. The image of the child's fragile hand clutching his own had shattered any reserve he once held about rules, regulations, or reputations. And so Bill had drawn on Spencer Publications' reserves, tapped every liquid asset he could, and entrusted Grace Buckingham, the elegant financier whose loyalty was as unshakable as her discretion, to deliver the funds and oversee the covert extraction of Liam from the pediatric oncology wing. But now Bill sensed the tide turning against him. Rumors swirled through the labyrinthine corridors of power at Spencer Publications. Whispers that the CEO had misappropriated company funds, engaged in unauthorized international transactions, and hidden the truth from both the board of directors and his own family. The board's counsel, a trio of hawkish attorneys and financial advisors, had convened an emergency session in his absence, something they'd never dared do even when he'd engineered the hostile takeover of Forrester Creations. Emails leaked to the press hinted at offshore accounts seeded with corporate money, and the journalists on deadline scented a scandal that could eclipse any they'd covered before. More damning still was the personal fallout, Ridge Forrester's fury, Brooke Logan's sense of betrayal, and even Hope's shaken faith in her grandfather's integrity. Bill had acted out of love for Liam, he reminded himself, but love was a poor defense in the face of corporate bylaws and public outrage. Across town, Brooke Logan paced in her designer living room, her phone clutched in one hand, thumb hovering over the text message she'd just received from Thomas. They're asking hard questions at the board. Dad's in trouble. Her mind raced back to the night the call had come in. Bill's voice thick with anguish as he explained the tumor's relentless progression, the failed attempts at conventional chemotherapy, and the doctor's final verdict that without radical intervention, Liam had mere weeks to live. Brooke had known she couldn't let her son die waiting for hospital approvals or insurance paperwork, but she also knew the deception would come at a cost. Bill had insisted on secrecy, warning her that even Ridge couldn't be told until the treatment was underway, that any leak would jeopardize the fragile arrangements Grace had painstakingly negotiated. Still, the moment Brooke saw Liam's gaunt face pressed against her shoulder, she'd understood why Bill would risk everything to defy the rules. And now, as she watched the sun dip below the Pacific horizon, painting her panoramic windows in bruised purples and reds, she worried whether saving one life might destroy countless others. Down in the bowels of Spencer Publications, the boardroom was a scene of controlled chaos. Caroline Spencer, recently appointed interim chief operating officer in the aftermath of Bill's impromptu departure, tried to maintain order as a barrage of questions rained down on her. "Where did the funds go?" demanded Robert Hale, chief financial officer, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he sifted through bank statements that betrayed unorthodox entries. "We see wire transfers to a Swiss clinic, over $1 million, coded as special project." "What special project warrants bypassing every internal control we have?" Caroline took a steadying breath, relying on her years of negotiation experience. It was an emergency medical situation, she replied evenly. Our chairman, Bill Spencer, authorized it personally to save his grandson's life. The board was not consulted in order to avoid delays that could have cost the boy precious time. An audible murmur of discontent rippled around the table. That's not how a publicly traded company operates, snapped Janet Winthrop, a board director known for her icy pragmatism. You're telling us our chairman used company finances as his personal piggy bank? Do you realize the SEC implications? The threat hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. At the same time, Grace Buckingham sat alone in her penthouse apartment on the 52nd floor, swirling a glass of red wine as reports of the brewing scandal flickered across her tablet screen. She had facilitated the million-dollar transfer with stoic professionalism, arranging the necessary shell entities, ensuring the funds cleared without detection, and personally handing off the clinical trial agreements to the Swiss doctor. She'd believed wholeheartedly in Liam's chance for a miracle, but she'd known the financial architects of Spencer Publications would eventually ask why. She tapped a message to Bill. Media is circling. Board convening tomorrow. We need a unified statement, or they'll devour this. Her heart pounded as she hit send, aware that her own reputation was on the line. If the hospital's confidentiality agreements fractured, if the back channel she'd constructed unraveled, every clandestine movement she'd orchestrated for the past decade would be scrutinized, and her career could disintegrate overnight. Meanwhile, Luna Nozawa, recently released on bail thanks to Bill's discreet lobbying of the DA, was caught in her own maelstrom of uncertainty. Freed from prison after the charges for the assault on Steffy Forrester were dropped in a controversial plea deal, rumors claimed Bill had personally intervened to smooth Luna's path to release, promising the DA a hefty donation to the children's charity he'd founded in Brooke's name. Luna had accepted release with bewildered relief, but also with a sense of foreboding. Everyone she knew seemed to be pawns in a game she barely understood. Was Bill her savior, or had he bartered her freedom for access to Grace, to the funds he needed? And most chillingly, would he use her as a scapegoat if the Liam scheme collapsed? Luna paced her minimal apartment in Tokyo's upscale Roppongi district. Bill had arranged her temporary housing here, wondering whether the architect of her liberation might also doom her if it served his ends. Back in Los Angeles, Bill knew the time had come to face the music. The following morning, he strode into Spencer Publications' boardroom, unaccompanied, his tailored suit and steel-gray hair lending him an air of imperious confidence that belied his inner turmoil. Directors seated around the mahogany table rose in polite greeting, though their eyes were cold and calculating. Bill nodded curtly before taking his seat at the head of the table. "I'm here to answer your questions," he said, voice low but clear. The legal counsel, a hawk-faced woman named Meredith Crane, opened the proceedings. "Mr. Spencer, can you explain why you authorized transfers in excess of $1 million to a facility in Geneva labeled only as Project Phoenix?" Bill met her gaze unwaveringly. "My grandson, Liam, was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor that standard treatments couldn't touch. I arranged the funds to secure an experimental therapy that offered him a fighting chance. I understand no protocol was followed, but I will not apologize for saving my grandson's life." A silence followed, thick, tense, electric. Then came the reckoning. Robert Hale slammed his fist on the table, rattling water glasses. "Your grandson's life is important, Mr. Spencer, but so is the financial integrity of this company. You risked shareholder value, breached fiduciary duty, and exposed us to regulatory fines. What do you propose we tell our investors?" Bill leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. "We tell them the truth," he replied. "We've always been transparent with our stakeholders when it matters. My personal funds will be used to retroactively reimburse the company. I will liquidate private assets, real estate, personal stock holdings to cover every cent. and I will accept any personal liability necessary, including fines or temporary suspension, to protect Spencer Publications and its shareholders." The board members exchanged stunned glances. The man who had built an empire by crushing adversaries was now offering to strip himself bare to protect the institution he'd created. Outside the boardroom, Brooke and Ridge watched the black Suburban pull away, Bill's silhouette fleeting in the rear window. Ridge's face was a mask of conflicted emotion, pride in his father's sacrifice, anger at the secrecy and the lies, fear for Liam's health, and uncertainty about Brooke's forgiveness. Brooke slipped her hand into Ridge's, her touch a silent promise. They would weather this storm together, just as they had faced every other betrayal and tragedy. Behind them, Thomas approached, bearing news of his own. The lab in Switzerland had confirmed that Liam's tumor had shrunk by 40% after the first round of infusion therapy, a clinical result that defied expectations and offered a glimmer of hope. Brooke's eyes filled with tears as she clung to Ridge. Even in the face of corporate ruin and legal jeopardy, the miracle unfolding in Geneva felt like a divine vindication of Bill's desperate gamble. As night fell over Los Angeles once more, the city lights blinking on like distant galaxies, the Spencer family gathered in the mansion's grand dining hall for an impromptu dinner. The table was laden with comfort food: Heidi's meatloaf, mashed potatoes, Ridge's favorite roasted Brussels sprouts. All symbols of home and continuity in a world gone mad with scandal. Bill arrived late, unshaven and weary but resolute, and took his place at the head. In the low glow of crystal chandeliers, he raised a glass of aged scotch. To Liam, he said, voice thick with emotion, "May he beat this, and may we find forgiveness in the fallout." Brooke, Ridge, Thomas, and even Luna, who had arrived with trembling gratitude, echoed the toast, their glasses clinking in defiant unity. Outside, the distant hum of traffic and the faint pulse of the city reminded them that life and business would continue, shaped by this tumultuous chapter, but not defined by it. In the days that followed, Bill's pledge to reimburse Spencer Publications began in earnest. Press releases heralded the founder's personal sacrifice, investors responded with cautious approval, and the SEC issued a statement acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances while reserving the right to review company filings. Grace Buckingham managed the forensic accounting needed to trace every transaction, her expertise ensuring that no trace of misappropriation remained on the books. Luna's public statement, arranged by Bill's attorneys, credited his philanthropy for funding crucial women's health programs, redirecting attention from her own release to his broader charitable mission. The media cycle, ever fickle, shifted its gaze from outrage to admiration, the tycoon who risked ruin for family, the billionaire grandfather whose wealth became a lifeline rather than a fortress. And in Switzerland, Liam's treatment continued under the watchful eyes of pioneering researchers. The child, bolstered by youthful resilience and the fierce love of his parents and grandparents, endured each infusion with remarkable courage. Test results every 48 hours showed continued tumor regression, a testament to the therapy's promise and a vindication of Bill's secret crusade. Messages from Brooke and Ridge flew across the globe, bringing hope to the sterile corridors of the clinic, reminding Liam that he was never alone in his battle. By the time autumn's first golden leaves drifted through Bel Air, the Spencer family had weathered one of its gravest crises. Spencer Publications stock had rebounded, thanks to Bill's restitution and renewed investor confidence. The hospital board in Geneva had officially green-lit the clinical trial, citing Liam's case as proof of concept. And truths once buried in shadow had emerged, not to destroy but to heal families, organizations, and reputations alike. Bill sat once more in the study, the ledger now closed and his name cleared of corporate malfeasance. He allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile as he watched Liam's latest video call, the boy's laughter ringing through his phone's speaker like a promise fulfilled. All around him lay the ruins and resurrection wrought by his decisions, battles fought in boardrooms and operating theaters, secrets exposed and sins absolved, a family torn and remade. And in the quiet triumph of that moment, Bill understood that power, when wielded by love, could build as surely as it could destroy, and that the greatest victories were often born of the greatest risks.